glad to be here in San Jose. I grew up down here and I drove around a little bit earlier just to see things, and everything's different. I think when I lived here 100 years ago, we still had some orchards and stuff like that. You know, thank God for progress. Anyway, glad to be here and glad to share a celebration of how much we have in common. We who have issues, as we say in California, we who are addicts and alcoholics, and people who love them. I was sober a little bit, and I read a book by Claudia Black called It Will Never Happen to Me. And she grew up, middle child, both parents alcoholic, and she was pretty sure that she was smart enough and clever enough to avoid any difficulty with booze. And of course it did happen to her, and she did get into recovery, and like a lot of remarkable women in recovery, she started looking at the family and the system and how things work and don't work. I think one of the ways we talk about families in crisis is we talk about a dysfunctional family. And a dysfunctional family does not mean the family doesn't work. Dysfunctional, D-Y-S, an addict, sometimes everything gets worn out. Everything gets worn out. To love, to hope, to participate, to have joy, you need some energy and you need some health and you need some focus. And alcoholism and addiction has a way of draining that real fast. So in her book, she says in a family with difficulties like this, 3 rules get followed. Rule number 1, don't talk. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about the drinking or the drugging. We're not going to talk about the suicide or the mental illness. We're not going to talk about molestation. We're not going to talk about abuse. We're fine, thank you very much. We're not going to put words to this. And I think the thinking is, if we don't talk about it, it's not real. At least if we don't talk about it, we don't have to deal with it. So what we learn to do is circumlocution. We talk around stuff. Or euphemism. We use nice words to discuss awful things. In my family, we never talked about alcoholism, but if you had cancer, we said, she's not feeling well. You can't say cancer out loud. So euphemism. And in a lot of families with difficulties, a code is spoken. And you have to figure out what the code is. I know what they said, but what do they mean is a pretty good question. We don't talk. Coming into recovery, we're given some instructions. And one of the instructions that my sponsor has, I'll say nagged this over and over for the many years. Identify, don't compare, identify, don't compare, identify, don't compare. When someone is sharing, listen for the similarities, not the differences. And that takes a while, because a lot of us, when we first get into recovery, we notice the differences. They're too old, they're too young, they're too much like this, they're not enough like that. I'm not like them. I am unique, special, and different. And what might work for you is not going to work for me, because I'm better than you or I'm worse than you, but I'm not like you. And that went on for me for months and months and months and months, until I finally had a moment of clarity, sitting in a meeting in the East Bay, maybe Oakland, maybe Berkeley, maybe El Cerrito, one of those East Bay hotspots. I was at a room and I suddenly noticed that everybody in the room had a lot in common. And I was in the room, and that recovery was available for anybody in the room, and I was in the room. I was participating. And that was 8 or 9 or 10 months of lots of meetings and lots of meetings and lots of meetings. And the defenses finally get worn down a little tiny bit. Learning how to listen for the similarities. And then learning how to speak. learning how to speak about the similarities, learning how to build bridges, learning how to make connection, stopping using language that shoved people away. Harsh language, angry language, cynical language. Not talking about how special I am, but how much we have in common. My sponsor, on more than one occasion, has talked about how those of us in recovery, whether it's Overeaters Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Al-Anon, Alateen, ACA, any of those programs, we are friends, we are companions, and we are allies. We are friends, we are companions, and we are allies. And that helps break down some of the isolated thinking and some of the rigidity that can take place in my head. I think the end result of any good addiction is isolation. Whether it's 3 bottles of tequila or 5 loaves of French bread or 12 hours of internet porn, by the end of the run, you're pretty much by yourself. So how do we make the connections? My sponsor would say, this is about talking now, learn how to tell the truth simply, without drama, without blaming anybody else, and without letting yourself off the hook. Just tell the story without editorial opinion. And that takes about 10 years. That takes about 10 years. Do not be discouraged. Do not be discouraged. And when I've been to meetings with him, and I hate everybody in the room, and I think they're fools, and someone talked, and I think he's an idiot, and I need to comment on that. And I'll leave the meeting at the end of the meeting and be talking to my sponsor, and I said, boy, that was a terrible meeting full of awful people. And he said, were we at the same meeting? Clearly not. I'm busy pushing people away and shoving people down and running away. Learning how to talk in ways that bring us together. I've noticed, I do have some church connections, and church people, some church people will argue about anything. And some church people will argue about everything. And I think that happens in meetings too. Some people in recovery, they're just waiting for someone to start an argument with. I was at a meeting in San Francisco, and they referred to this one guy, and they said he was such a difficult person, he could get into an argument when he's alone in the room. I don't want to be that person, but I sure can be. So the talking, we have to learn how to talk. Rule 2, Claudia Black would say, is we don't trust. You've been manipulated, you've been assaulted, you've been discounted, you've been shamed. You just don't trust. Don't let anyone in, don't let anyone see the vulnerability. Today's confidence can become tomorrow's ammunition, and you don't want that to happen. So you keep people away. And again, this reinforces a lot of the isolation. We don't talk about those things. Lots of avoidance. Don't trust. I don't know if my ability to trust never grew very much, or whether it had been broken, but the fact was I just didn't know how to do that. It was very undeveloped in my heart and in my soul, and I think if you run with a lot of addicts and alcoholics, not trusting anybody is a pretty smart decision for self-protection, for survival. But then you get into recovery, and are there women and men you can trust? Can you trust everybody at a meeting? No, that's dumb. People are there for different motives. Some are there to recover, and some are there to borrow money, and some are there to date. That's always helpful. But you find there are people you can trust over time, and you can be a person who can be trusted. And one of the things about trust is keeping confidences. I heard a fellow, he's been gone now for a few years, I think HIV took him out. His name was Jostler P. from Pasadena or Glendale, one of those funny little LA towns. You can't say that down there, they'll get defensive and blame you. But they're little LA towns. And he said about this, trusting, he said, anonymity is anonymity, and confidentiality is confidentiality, but news is news. And too many of us do that. I wouldn't say anything about George unless it was good, and boy, is this good. You know, that's that kind of thing. We can be very, very gossipy. And it takes a while to realize that although a number of us do that, some people don't. And some people really do keep confidences close. And they don't violate that bond. And I find that very, very important. I also found out that some people just blab anything that goes on to anybody who will listen. And I'm not as forthcoming with those folks. They're not going to change. Talking about stuff, trusting. And the third thing that she writes about in her book is feeling. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Because if you feel anything, you feel lousy. Now, I think feelings they make me vulnerable, they make me feel stupid, I'm inefficient, I don't get much done. I was sober a couple of years. I was living in Los Angeles. I got sober in Berkeley in 1976. And in 77, I moved to Los Angeles to begin teaching, go back to the classroom. It was a very difficult year. Even though I had taught before, I had never taught before sober. And that is like never having taught before. You just have to learn everything. But I would go to movies. I found Los Angeles to be captivating and exciting and interesting. It's also a huge amount of hard work. And when I lived there many years ago, everything was an hour away. And now everything's an hour and a half away. And everybody's tired all the time from the travel. That's just one of the things. I mentioned that to my sponsor, and he bristled. He's a Los Angeles guy. He even gets upset if you say, I can't breathe. He gets upset, you know. Defensive Los Angeles people. Come on now, where are we going with that? I hope that comes back. Feeling. I was waking up, and it took a couple of years, but I was waking up more, and I went to see a movie called Ordinary People with Mary Tyler Moore and Donald Sutherland. And it's the first time I cried in recovery. That film touched me, and I had years of uncried tears. And I went back the next day. I think the first time I saw the movie, halfway through, I began crying. I went back the next day, and I started crying when the movie began. There were just this huge amount of uncried tears. Mary Tyler Moore, Mary Tyler M., and Donald Sutherland played parents, and they're affluent, and they're earnest, and they're hardworking people, and they had 2 boys, and one of them was killed in a terrible accident. And the younger brother survived, played by Timothy Hutton. And so you see a family that has experienced tragedy, but has not survived tragedy. They're in trouble. They're in real trouble. And the boy is tense and upset, and he doesn't want to feel anything, and he does something stupid, and so they send him to a therapist played by Judd Hirsch. And Judd Hirsch he's played comedians for 100 years on different things, but he plays a very straight role in this, a very serious guy who plays the therapist. And Timothy Hutton goes to see his shrink, and the shrink says, "Why are you here?" And the boy says, "I want control. I want more control. I have to be in control of my thoughts and my feelings. I don't want them to get away from me." And the shrink's response is, "I'm not that good on control. Let's talk." And they begin a conversation that does last for a while. But I identified with the young Timothy Hutton. What I loved about alcohol and marijuana was I didn't have to feel anything if I was using. I didn't have to feel upset. It was sedation time. And I haven't had a drink in a long time. I don't smoke dope because it's a very bad policy for people like me. And when I was put into treatment, I was there for, 10 days or so. And I had been sedated for years. And we're sitting in group, and suddenly my arms and legs began tingling like I'd slept on them wrong, and the blood was rushing back into my arms and legs. It was extremely uncomfortable and extremely sudden. And I remember standing up saying, "My arms and legs are coming off." And they always have a nurse, at group. And she said, "That's called sensation. It's really good when it comes back." But it didn't feel good. It felt scary, and it felt awful, and it felt like something was wrong because I was feeling something. And in those first couple of months and first couple of years of waking up from some very bad behavior, I was told this: feeling anything is better than feeling nothing. And I chose to believe that then, and I choose to believe that now. I have to remind myself of it, especially when I'm feeling something I don't like. Anyway, later in the movie, healing does happen in this film. And the young boy has some events, and he's in a bit of a crisis, and he goes to talk to the shrink about being upset, and the shrink tries to make nice, and the boy says to him, "I'm just feeling. Will you leave me alone? I'm just having some feelings." Which is when I started to cry, I think, the first time. This was so remarkable. Feeling anything is better than feeling nothing. And in the treatment place I went to, they had a big poster on the wall, smiley faces, and they weren't all smiley faces. Mad, glad, sad, and then a whole bunch of others. And they were words. I knew the words, but I had no idea how that corresponded to anything that was going on inside of me. And that process of learning how to have a feeling, how to know what the feeling is, how to let the feeling pass, was a good 10 years of recovery. Maybe 15. In the late 80s, when AIDS roared through the recovery community, lots of us were vulnerable, and lots of us got sick. And in the very, very early days of the plague, you'd see somebody on Monday and they were fine and they were dead on Friday. And it was terrifying. And what started coming up for me was a lot of stuff concerning the feelings of grief. A whole new vocabulary for me to learn. That sometimes I was numb, and sometimes I was sad, and sometimes I was angry, and sometimes I couldn't remember anything, and sometimes I was exhausted. And that's all grief. And when you think you're losing your mind, it's just grief. And that was a very important process. Going to meetings, talking about it, did some therapy around it. And I found that on the other side of that grief, there was a lot of room. Room that I just didn't have before. So I guess the message from these opening remarks are, if you're fairly new in recovery, there's so much to experience, and there's so much to learn, and life gets bigger. Sometimes what we'll say to newcomers is, keep coming back, it gets better. Have you ever heard that? And I was in Sweden. I've been there several times, and it's kind of my fantasy world. When I think you're not treating me well enough, I'll go to Scandinavia, they'll treat me better. That's not true, but that's a fantasy. Anyway, I was at a meeting in Stockholm, small meeting, 8 or 10 people, and an American woman came into the meeting. And I didn't like her immediately. Now, I know you've never done that. Just by the way someone walked in, you disliked them. So there she sat, and I disapproved. And she mentioned something inane, and I was patronizing. I was a patronizing jerk. And I told her, keep coming back. It gets better. Patronizing. And she looked at me and she said, we don't say that in New York. And I said, really? Well, what do you say in New York? And she said, in New York we say, keep coming back. First it gets better. Then it gets worse. Then it gets real. Then it gets different. Then it gets real different. And that does match my experience. It's real different than it used to be. But some days are very long and some things are very difficult. Last week I want to report on my emotional, spiritual, and psychological health by telling you that on one day last week, I think it was Thursday, I prayed at the local parish. I went to a meeting. I went to the dentist. I changed. I had the tires exchanged on my car. I got a flu shot, and I had the gutters cleaned in the house. First time in 8 years. And I consider that to be an incredibly mature adult day. All those things that you do, In fact, when the person at Safeway was giving me the flu shot, it was just fine. She said, you okay? And I said, I'm very grown up today. Here in my 71st year, I'm very adult today. Closer to 80 than 50. That's where we are today. This is, I heard this on National Public Radio a couple of months ago. It's a poem by Stephen Dunn, D-U-N-N. And it's entitled, On the Death of a Colleague. And I thought I'd share that with you this afternoon. He writes, she taught theater. So we gathered in the theater. We praised her voice, her knowledge, how good she was with Godot. And just 4 months later with Gigi. She was 50. The problem in the liver. Each of us recalled an incident in which she'd been kind or witty. I told about being unable to speak from my diaphragm and how she made me lie down, placed her hand where the failure was, and showed me how to breathe. But afterwards, I could only do it when I lay down. and that became a joke between us. And I told it as my offering to the audience. I was on stage, and I heard myself wishing to be impressive. Someone else spoke of her cats, and no one spoke of her face or the last few parties. The fact was, I had avoided her for months. It was a student's turn to speak, a sophomore, one of her actors. She was a drunk, he said. Often came to class reeking. Sometimes he couldn't look at her, the blotches, the awful puffiness. And yet she was a great teacher, and he loved her. But he thought someone should say what everybody knew, because she didn't die by accident. Everyone was crying, and it was almost over now. The remaining speaker and historian said he'd cut his speech short. And the chairman stood up, as if by habit, and said something about loss and thanked us for coming. None of us moved except some students to the student who'd spoken, and then others moved to him across the dividers. I don't know if you've ever been to a memorial service or a funeral like that. I have. One of my acquaintances died, very, very bright lawyer, a guy named Mike C., Los Angeles. Funny, hilarious. Lived on Skid Row, lived out of his car, finally gets sober, but his liver does fail and he does die when he's about a year sober. And there is a memorial service at Loyola University in Los Angeles, and all his pals were there, and it was very much like this. Funny stories told, lots of laughter. He was so funny, he was so bright, he was wonderful, he made people laugh. What a great guy, everyone loved him. And then after 5 or 6 of these, Irish lawyers stood up to tell stories. Another guy stood up and he said, I'm so glad you shared all these wonderful things about Mike when he was a young man. He said, I'd like to tell you about his last 5 years. And then the guy told his name and he said, I'm Mike's sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous. And he died as a sober man. But his last years were very different. And then he proceeded just to tell the truth. The party was over. No one said, well, let's keep coming back and tell a few more things. It just takes the wind out of your sails when the truth is told about the deadly disease which we share and which we live with and which we recover from a day at a time. Dr. Silkworth was a physician who loved alcoholics. Most don't. Most physicians and therapists think we are a pain in the butt. How is that possible? Well, we don't follow directions. We lie, and then we blame them. That's why. But Dr. Silkworth loved alcoholics, and he developed a knack for working with us and spending time with us. And he, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, figured that this was some kind of disease, and he called it an allergy of the body and an obsession of the mind. I've got both of those. I'm allergic and I'm obsessed. He believed that the first drink gets you drunk. He believed that recovery was possible And it happens in little bits, in little bits, in little bits. And in 1934, he dealt with one more alcoholic for the third time that year. And this fellow had an experience of the room filling with light and the obsession to drink being removed. And Silkworth worked with him and spent some time with him and gave him a few general ideas, which this fellow began to make practical as soon as he could. And he tries to save the world. I'm going to save the world. He'd go into bars in New York at night and try to get people sober. Don't you want to be sober? The answer's no. If it's 10 p.m. and you're having a beer, leave me alone. And Bill would say, oh, I saw God, I saw. And they just think you're crazy when you do that. Crazy. You're off your meds. Leave me alone. And he talked to Dr. Silkworth, and Dr. Silkworth said, your desire to be of help is wonderful. Talk about the disease and talk about your experience. Don't sound crazy. Leave the God stuff for a while. One of my friends says, the first 3 steps are make your bed and get a job. Steps 1, 2, 3. Well, Bill Wilson tries and tries and tries, and no one cares, and no one gets sober. And he comes home one night very discouraged. And he talks to his wife, Lois, and he says to her, no one's well, no one cares, no one's interested. I'm a failure. And Lois looks at him and says, Bill, you're still sober. Light bulb. If I try to give it away, one day at a time, I won't have to drink. The successful 12-step call is the one you leave sober. And then he goes to Akron, Ohio, because he wants to be a billionaire. He wants to be a fat cat. He wants to be a Wall Street genius. And he tries to make some money, and he talks to people, but everything falls apart. And he's 6 months clean and sober, and he gets thirsty. He calls some pastors of local churches. Do you have a drunk I could talk to? Do you have a drunk I could talk to? Do you have a drunk I could talk to? Everyone's busy. Finally, someone says, yeah, here's someone. He calls a woman named Henrietta Seiberling. Do you have a drunk I could talk to? And she says, I really do. And Bill goes to meet Dr. Robert Smith. Now, Dr. Smith is older than he is by a generation or more. He's a bright guy. He's a physician. He's very cynical. He's very discouraged. He's very broken. He's read everything. He's talked to everybody who knows or claims to know anything about the disease. And he still gets drunk every night. When people promise you solutions and cures and help, and none of it comes through, you get cynical. One of my friends in the early days of HIV, he was sick for a couple of years before he died. He said, we have what we call the Cure of the Month Club. Every month, someone comes up with a cure, and you believe the first 2 or 3 dozen of them. And then you don't believe any of them. So, Henrietta says, Dr. Smith, I have someone who can help you. Let's make the call. We're going to stay 15 minutes. I'd much rather be drunk by myself than talking to this New Yorker. And they meet, and Bob Smith says, "So what are you selling?" And Bill Wilson says, "I'm not selling you anything. If you just sit and listen to me, I'm going to stay sober till midnight today." What? And he was able to hear him because Bill talked out of his own experiences, and they made a connection based on the mutuality of their suffering. Dr. Bob relapses. Lots of people relapse. Half the early fellowship relapsed. And then he comes home and he has surgery the next morning. He's a proctologist. It's not good when you're shaking, you know? And the way Bill Wilson tells the story is, surgery's due. The patient's over there. The doctor will be with you in just a second. You know, he gave him a bottle of beer to stop the shaking, and a couple of goofballs, speed, to help him focus. The doctor's ready. And that was his last drink. Within a short amount of time, they know they have to find someone else to talk to. They find member number 3, and they track him down to the hospital. He's strapped down in the bed when they make their first visit. And what do? They talk about the disease and they tell their stories. They talk about the disease and they tell their stories. One person talking to another with that radical democracy. You remember when you say you are. I like that. The highest rank anyone gets is sober. And every member owns 1 share of stock in the program. We're equal owners and we're equal members. And we rotate leadership because we do not want to turn into North Korea. Which can happen, you know, and has happened in some meetings, I'm told. Allergy of the body, obsession of the mind. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. One of the physicians I've known and loved over the many years is Dr. Gill. Dr. Gill Ayat, who was up in Marin County. French Canada, grew up in the 1920s and 30s during Prohibition in the United States. He would see Americans come to Canada to get drunk and have fistfights in parking lots, and said to himself, I can't wait to move there. And he moved to San Francisco and started his family, and life happened. And Dr. Gill gets sober when Eisenhower's president. And then a relapse under Mr. Kennedy, and he gets sober again with Lyndon Johnson, which is quite amazing. I used to get drunk whenever Lyndon Johnson talked. I was drunk and yelling at the television said, I've done that with more than one president. Once, who makes no difference who the president was, this one guy who I couldn't stand, he was talking on the TV. He was wishing people Merry Christmas, as a matter of fact, and I was yelling at the TV, calling him an idiot and a fool, and he should be ashamed of himself. And one of my pals said to me, can't you even let him wish people Merry Christmas? No, I have principles. Well, I was a crazy person. You know, back off, let go, back off, let go. Gill would talk about alcoholism, and the way he would talk about it is it's a disease with 3 phases, 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is the fun phase. This is when it's fun. And for an awful lot of us who are addicts, the initial run is really sensational. And we want to do it over and over and over again. It's really fun. And Non-alcoholics don't know how much fun drinking can be. I mean, they can take it or leave it. It's a big disappointment. What's wrong with them? My middle brother, when he was in Vietnam, he drank like we did, and then he came back to the States and became a very boring person. And that's not a judgment, that's an observation. Just as square as you can get. Became oh well. Anyway, I'm drinking. And I said, Paul, can I get you another drink? And he said, oh, no thanks, I'm starting to feel it. Now, what kind of perversion is that, I ask you? And I explained to him, we get on the horse to ride. But a lot of people don't. I mean, it's just, I met a woman named Clara. She was an old lady with tennis shoes. I mean, a real old lady wearing tennis shoes. And we became friendly, and we talked about a few things, and I guess I was in my 30s and she was in her 80s somewhat. And I said to her, Clara, did you ever drink? And she said, once. And I said, what happened? She said, well, I got a headache, so I never wanted to do it again. I ask you, where is the discipline? You go beyond the headache and do alcoholism. So she may have been allergic, but she wasn't obsessed. You know, you need both. You need both. Oh my. So fun. Stage 1 alcoholism. Stage 1 addiction. Stage 2. Fun plus problems. It's still fun. But you start to have problems. You know, you pee on yourself. You throw up on your date, and you get an unfortunate tattoo. One of my pals works with gang guys down in L.A. And one of the things as you get out of the gang and get clean and sober, that frequently goes together, you get tattoos removed. And this fellow had tape tattooed across his forehead, fuck you! And the problem with that is people don't hire you right away if that's on your forehead. They tried bangs, you know, but it's not as effective. So, tattoos. You lose a job, you lose a family, you lose your health, you lose a limb, you get hospitalized a couple of times. It's becoming less fun. Fun plus problems. And stage 3 alcoholism is just called problems. The fun's over. Now, if we were not crazy, when the fun stopped, we would stop. But if you're a crazy person, such as myself, when the fun stops, what you want to do is try harder. Keep it secret. Try harder. Manage. I can take care of this. Don't tell anyone. So the first step of recovery, we admitted we were powerless over that long list of things, and that our lives had become unmanageable. That first step of recovery is really just asking this simple question. Are you still having any fun? And if you're still having fun, we do not look good to you. Well, I may have trouble, but I'm not that bad. There's a dozen jokes on the subject, you know, talking about going into recovery and talking to family members, and you'll say, well, is there any alcoholism in your family? Oh yeah, some people had trouble. My Aunt Sally died of alcoholism, and my brother Fred died of alcoholism. Did they ever try AA? Oh, they weren't that bad. Step 1. It's the gift of desperation. If you are desperate enough, we look good. If you're in the fun stage of alcoholism, we hope you get to problems really soon. It saves so much trouble. I was intervened on. I mean, I don't ask for help. I'm going to go underground and try harder by myself, thank you. But in the late 1960s and early 70s, some people did some education, some public information, National Council on Alcoholism stuff with leaders of the Catholic community, bishops and provincials and superiors of the different communities. And what they explained to all these people in charge was that this was a disease. It was a recognizable disease. It was a treatable disease. If you have people showing signs of trouble, get them some help. And we had a new boss, and I was his first alcoholic. So I got, it was time. What a relief, what a relief. And I was done. I had tried everything, and I was just at my wit's end. And I had no fight left in me. I went to an AA meeting in Oakland on Friday night. They didn't tell me it was an old-timers meeting. I was 29. I was dressed exactly the same as I am now. My hair was a lot longer. My beard was dark, and I was 30 pounds lighter. Other than that, this is me. And I went to this meeting full of really old people. And, they were happy and friendly. And you just can only take so much of that, you know? I was a little isolated. I had some trouble with people, a run-in with the Berkeley Police Department, and out with some friends, and I became argumentative and got thrown out of the bar, which has since closed, and I'm sure that's God's punishment on them. And a few other things, and I black out and some embarrassing things. Anyway, what happened the next day is I knew that I had lost track of the evening. And so what I decided was this: I can no longer drink with people. I can't stand the witnesses. Isolation is the way out, you know, and I can drink by myself because I'll need that. It never occurred to me not to drink. I have to control and manage this, you know. So, anyway, I go to this first meeting. I'd been a little isolated for a while. And hi, Tom! They're so friendly. God. And there was a fellow sitting next to me who told me what to do. He said, we here in Alcoholics Anonymous go to lots of meetings. It's okay. I'm willing. I hadn't been doing a lot of much lately. I thought a couple of meetings a month would be a lot of meetings. We go to lots of meetings. Then he said, and we don't drink in between meetings. Genius. If I go to a meeting a day, this will be easier. And then he said, and we don't use no dope, which I really didn't know. I had been smoking non-habit-forming marijuana every day for 7 to 10 years, something like that. It's hard to tell. Sedation. And when he said we don't do that, I just believed him. I've never done cocaine or dropped acid or any of those things, which I think is a very good thing. I saw a therapist once for Valium. I thought Valium would help. A lot of my friends were using it, and they seemed more peaceful. And this was Dr. Arthur Solomon in San Francisco, and I said, I'd seen him now for a month, and I said, Dr. Solomon, can I get a Valium prescription from you? And he said, no. And I didn't know they could do that. And I said, why not? He said, because you'd abuse it. I said, exactly. I'm looking forward to abusing it. So I've done a little bit of Valium. A couple of friends gave me some of theirs, which I think is very intimate. That's a very important sharing. And I've stolen Valium from a couple of people too, which I'm never going to even mention. And here's my problem with Valium. And the others. I mean, I suspect others are similar. Valium takes 20 minutes. Who has that kind of time? What I liked about alcohol is it was instant. It was instant. I remember teaching at Loyola High School in Los Angeles, one of those hot LA days, and kids were awful, and other teachers were just awful, and I hated everybody. And I went back to the Jesuit house, and I got a water glass and threw some ice in there and filled it up with bourbon, vodka, or gin, the 3 favorite flavors. And I took that glass, and I downed it in 3 gulps, and I felt better instantly. Let's do that again. Boom, fill that one right up. Down, 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 down. And for the first time all day, I can breathe. And then number 3. Okay, this is, we'll nurse number 3, but the evening has been begun. Think, alcohol works so well when it works. If I could still do that, I'd still do that. But it just stopped working. Fun plus problems. Oh, man. So, there's so much more to not drinking than not drinking. The brain has to get rewired. Old patterns have to get redone. New things need to develop. And that takes a long time. It's still going on for me. I joined Al-Anon when I was 8 or 10 years sober because I did not want to be a sober person who was shooting people. And a lot of my Al-Anon issues deal specifically with exhaustion and rage. Of course, the AA say, well, who would you shoot? They don't know that in some of the very deep Al-Anon meetings, the topic is this: do you shoot to kill? Or do you shoot to maim? That's the question. And the room divides half and half. Because, a knee or an ankle, and they'll remember you whenever they try to move. And isn't that worth it? So, Al-Anon has helped a lot with the exhaustion and the rage. And I mentioned that at a meeting. A lady came up to me afterwards and she said, I'm sober, clean and sober 7 years, and I hate everybody. Should I start going to Al-Anon? And I said to her, hold out as long as you can. Don't rush to get well. If you get to Al-Anon too fast, it will freak you out. People knitting. Grown men holding stuffed animals. And then you find out that the grown men holding stuffed animals are Marines in recovery. And you have to rethink a lot of stuff. So easy does this. I was in South Africa for 6 weeks, and I got a chance to go to meetings and meet people and give some talks. It was a wonderful, all of July I was there. And I told this story, and this I'm wrapping up. This is the last 8 minutes. Alcoholism, drug addiction. It's like dancing with the gorilla. You're not done dancing until the gorilla is done dancing. This is about lack of power. Now, when I first heard the story, they did not say dancing with the gorilla. They said dating the gorilla. And they did not say dating. But you get the idea. And the gorilla's doing all the work. Now, the gorilla kills a lot of us. If you love alcoholics and addicts, you will know grief and you will know loss. Part of the Al-Anon conversation is about loss and grief. People who we love, they're so promising, they're so hopeful, and they go out with the gorilla one more time and they just don't come back. Happens all the time. When I bump into young people in recovery, bright, fresh, young folks, I tell them, I hope you live to be 35, and then 70, Oh my. If you're clean and sober today, it means the gorilla has let go. If the gorilla has let go, get out of the cage. And don't go back into the cage, even when the gorilla starts humming your song, which it does. Oh, no. I'll never do that again. It was so disgusting last time. Newspapers, policemen, goats. I will never go back to that. That was disgusting. I have too much self-respect and dignity to ever do that again. And then the moon's full, and it's a weekend, and you're a little tense, and you figure, I'll have one more dance. I have a friend in Las Vegas who says, I don't want to dance with the gorilla again, but every so often I want to pet it just a little bit. Now, we who love alcoholics and addicts, we visit the zoo a lot. And you go into the zoo, and you see lions and tigers and bears. Then you walk to the gorilla cage, and you look inside, and you see the person you love with the gorilla, and you want to do something. Take action. It might be your spouse. Lots of people get married to alcoholics. I have never wanted to marry an alcoholic. What's wrong with them? They marry alcoholic after alcoholic after alcoholic. I did a wedding once years ago. There was one woman, her name was Pam. Her father was an alcoholic. Her first husband was alcoholic. Her second husband, her third was alcoholic, and she was marrying an alcoholic who was sober. And with the wisdom of Solomon, I asked her, do you see a pattern here? And she said, not at all, because one was tall and one was short and one was fat and one was thin. I like different kinds of men, she said. Old Al-Anon is largely women married to alcoholic men. There also are men married to alcoholic women, but a lot of men don't stay with alcoholic women, just sociologically speaking. But that's a big Al-Anon contribution. The next group coming into Al-Anon are people like me, adult children of alcoholics. Moms and dads or grandparents were alcoholic. And we need some relief and a different way of thinking, and we go to Al-Anon as adult children. The new group coming into Al-Anon are moms and dads of alcoholics and addicts. The way sponsorship works there is, if you've been married to a lot of alcoholics, you can talk to people married to alcoholics. If you're an adult child, you can talk to adult children. But if you're a mom or a dad, you really need to talk to moms and dads, because they're the only ones who understand what it's like to not hear from your daughter or son for 3 years or 5 years. Anyway, you walk by the gorilla cage, you see the one you love with the gorilla, you need to do something, you get into the cage and you start vacuuming and sweeping. Changing the furniture around for the right feng shui, we're California. hang a nice picture of the Dalai Lama or Pope Francis. That's very helpful. Or make nice, nutritious meals, vegans. This will help. And none of it helps. And then you get between the gorilla and the person you love and you try to pull them apart, and the gorilla turns on you and yanks your arms and legs off. The casualty rates, physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, of those of us who love alcoholics and addicts are very, very high. So we need a program too, and it's called Al-Anon. And a lot of Al-Anon comes down to this: stay out of the cage. We're going to meet over by the giraffes and talk to other people who want to vacuum and clean other people's cages. And we can do that a day at a time. Thanks so much for coming today.